June 20th, 1947. Beverly Hills, California. 810 North Linden Drive. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel sat in the living room of Virginia Hill's rented mansion, reading the Los Angeles Times. The room was elegant, expensive furniture, thick curtains, the kind of luxury that came from skimming millions from the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. Outside, the street was quiet, residential, safe. At 10:45 p.m., a rifle barrel pushed through the window lattice. The shooter, never identified, never caught, fired 9 times with a .30 caliber M1 carbine. 2 bullets hit Siegel, one striking him in the head. He died instantly, slumped on the sofa, blood pooling on Virginia Hill's white carpet. The impact was devastating. His left eye was dislodged by the bullet's force. The murder was clean, professional, and sent a message that echoed across the West Coast underworld. The rules had changed. The hit was almost certainly ordered by East Coast mob bosses: Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello. Furious about the Flamingo's cost overruns and Siegel's suspected skimming. Whether Jack Dragna assisted with local logistics, providing safe houses, weapons, or intelligence remains unproven, though some accounts suggest he may have played a supporting role. The flashy, violent, media-hungry era of Jewish mobsters operating independently in Los Angeles was over, and the quiet, disciplined Italian Mafia, led by Jack Dragna, would attempt to reclaim territory they believed should have been theirs from the beginning. Most Americans have never heard of Jack Dragna. When they think Mafia, they picture New York's 5 families: Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, Bonanno. They think of Chicago's outfit, Al Capone's violent empire. Maybe Detroit with the Purple Gang, Philadelphia, Boston. But Los Angeles, the city of Hollywood glamour, sunshine, and sprawling suburbs? Americans don't associate LA with the Mafia. That's exactly how Jack Dragna wanted it. For roughly 2 decades, from the early 1930s through the mid-1950s, Dragna wielded significant influence over Italian organized crime in Southern California. He didn't control every criminal operation in the sprawling city. Chinese tongs operated independently in Chinatown. Jewish syndicates ran their own gambling operations. Mexican gangs controlled their territories, and independent bookmakers often ignored him entirely. But within Italian-American criminal networks, Dragna held substantial power through discipline, strategic invisibility, and control over key rackets like labor unions, gambling, and extortion. This is the story of the Los Angeles crime family. The Dragnas, their rise, their influence, and their slow fade into obscurity. It's the story of how one Sicilian immigrant built significant criminal operations in America's second largest city by doing what many Eastern mob families refuse to do: stay quiet, avoid unnecessary attention, and survive. Italian immigration to California began in the late 1800s, driven by economic opportunity in agriculture, fishing, and railroad construction. Sicilian immigrants, in particular, settled in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and smaller towns throughout the state. They brought with them the customs, language, and for some, the criminal traditions of southern Italy. By the early 1900s, Los Angeles had a small but growing Italian community concentrated in neighborhoods near downtown, around North Broadway, near the plaza, and spreading into areas that would later become part of Lincoln Heights and Boyle Heights. The community was tight-knit, insular, and suspicious of American law enforcement, which often treated Italian immigrants as second-class citizens. Criminal activity existed within this community from the beginning. Black hand extortion, demanding money from successful Italian businessmen under threat of violence, was common. Letters would arrive demanding payments, signed with a crude drawing of a black hand. Victims rarely reported these threats to police, either out of fear or distrust of authorities. But black hand extortion was disorganized, opportunistic, individual. It wasn't the Mafia. Not yet. 1910s to 1920s. The first significant organized crime figure in Los Angeles was Joseph R. DeSimone, known as Iron Man Joe. Born in Sicily around 1884, DeSimone immigrated to the United States and settled in Los Angeles in the early 1900s. He was involved in extortion, bootlegging, and gambling, and by the 1920s he'd established himself as the most powerful Italian criminal in the city. DeSimone wasn't alone. The Dragna family, originally from New Orleans, where they'd been involved in organized crime since the 1800s, also had interests in Los Angeles. The Dragnas controlled gambling and bootlegging operations and clashed with DeSimone over territory and influence. The conflict between DeSimone and the Dragnas was violent, but small scale. Murders occurred, associates disappeared, bodies were found in alleys or dumped in the desert. But the violence didn't attract significant media attention. Los Angeles in the 1920s was booming, growing rapidly, and local newspapers were more interested in real estate development and Hollywood scandals than Italian gangsters killing each other in obscure disputes. This environment, rapid growth, weak political institutions, corruptible law enforcement, sprawling geography that made surveillance difficult, created perfect conditions for organized crime to flourish quietly. And into this environment, in 1914, arrived a Sicilian immigrant who would change everything: Ignazio Jack Dragna. April 18, 1891. Corleone, Sicily. Jack Dragna was born Ignazio Dragna in Corleone, Sicily, the same town that would later become infamous as the fictional birthplace of Vito Corleone in The Godfather. Corleone in the late 1800s was poor, rural, and controlled by the Mafia. Criminal organizations weren't separate from society. They were embedded in it, settling disputes, enforcing contracts, and providing protection in exchange for tribute. Dragna grew up in this environment, learning the codes, the hierarchies, the unspoken rules that governed Sicilian criminal culture. By his teens, he was likely involved in local rackets, though specific records from this period are scarce. In 1898, Dragna's family immigrated to the United States, settling initially in New York. Dragna was 7 years old. He grew up in Brooklyn and Manhattan's Italian neighborhoods, surrounded by the same criminal culture he'd left behind in Sicily, but now operating in an American context, with new opportunities and new challenges. By his late teens and early 20s, Dragna was involved in criminal activity in New York. He was arrested multiple times between 1914 and 1918 on charges including extortion and robbery. The arrests suggest he was working in black hand extortion or similar rackets, small-scale, violent, opportunistic crimes common among young Italian criminals in New York at the time. But Dragna was ambitious and smart. He understood that New York was crowded with Italian criminals, all competing for the same territory, all under constant pressure from police and rival gangs. Advancement was difficult. Survival required constant vigilance. So in 1914, Dragna made a decision that would define his entire criminal career. He left New York and moved to Los Angeles. Dragna arrived in Los Angeles with connections, family ties, possibly relationships with East Coast mobsters, and an understanding of how organized crime worked. But LA in 1914 was nothing like New York. The Italian community was smaller, more spread out, less organized. There was no established mafia family, no clear hierarchy, just individual operators like Joseph R. DeSimone running independent rackets. Dragna started small. He worked in the produce markets where Italian immigrants dominated the wholesale fruit and vegetable business. He built relationships, earned trust, and began organizing extortion rackets, forcing market vendors to pay for protection, which meant protection from Dragna himself. He also moved into bootlegging. Prohibition, which began in January 1920, transformed organized crime across America, and Dragna understood immediately that alcohol was the future. Los Angeles' sprawling geography, weak law enforcement, and proximity to Mexico made it ideal for smuggling operations. Dragna didn't run speakeasies or sell directly to consumers. He controlled distribution networks, the trucks, the warehouses, the supply chains that moved alcohol from Mexico and offshore ships into Los Angeles, and then distributed it to retail operations. This insulated him from street-level enforcement and allowed him to generate enormous profits with relatively low personal risk. By the mid-1920s, Dragna was one of the most powerful criminals in Los Angeles, and he did it quietly, without the violence and media attention that plagued mobsters in Chicago and New York. Dragna built his organization differently than East Coast families. He kept it small, fewer soldiers, fewer associates, but tight discipline and absolute loyalty. His brother, Tom Dragna, served as consigliere and later underboss, managing operations when Jack was unavailable or under law enforcement scrutiny. The family's core rackets included extortion, targeting Italian-owned businesses, produce markets, restaurants, bakeries, demanding regular payments for protection. Gambling, operating bookmaking operations, card games, and numbers rackets throughout Italian neighborhoods. Bootlegging, controlling alcohol distribution networks that supplied speakeasies and private clubs across Southern California. Labor racketeering, infiltrating unions, particularly the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA, which controlled the ports at San Pedro and Long Beach. Union control allowed Dragna to extort shipping companies, skim union dues, and place loyalists in no-show jobs. Dragna's principle was simple: make money, avoid attention, survive. He understood that the flashy, violent, media-hungry approach of gangsters like Al Capone attracted federal prosecutors, aggressive journalists, and reform movements. Dragna wanted none of that. He ran his operations like a business, quietly, efficiently, profitably. East Coast Mafia bosses, figures like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and later Vito Genovese, viewed Los Angeles as a backwater. The city was growing, but it didn't have the density, the industrial base, or the established criminal infrastructure of New York or Chicago. When they thought about LA at all, they thought of it as a secondary market, not worth serious investment. This was a mistake. Dragna understood that LA's sprawling geography, weak political institutions, and rapid growth created unique opportunities. He built a scalable, sustainable criminal organization that generated consistent revenue without the constant warfare that plagued Eastern families. By 1930, Jack Dragna was the undisputed boss of the Los Angeles Mafia family, and most Angelenos had no idea he existed. 1920 to 1933. Prohibition was the single most profitable criminal opportunity in American history, and Jack Dragna exploited it brilliantly. While East Coast mobsters fought bloody wars over speakeasy territory, Dragna focused on logistics, the unglamorous, essential work of moving alcohol from suppliers to distributors. Los Angeles' geography was both a challenge and an advantage. The city sprawled across hundreds of square miles connected by roads rather than concentrated in dense neighborhoods. This made enforcement difficult. Police couldn't surveil every warehouse, every truck route, every distribution point. but it also required sophisticated coordination. Dragna's bootlegging operation worked through layers. Supply. Alcohol came from multiple sources. Rum and whiskey were smuggled up from Mexico by truck or by boat along the coast. Ships would anchor outside U.S. territorial waters, known as Rum Row, and smaller boats would ferry crates to shore, landing at secluded beaches from Santa Monica to San Pedro. Canadian whiskey came down through San Francisco and was distributed south. Distribution. Dragna controlled warehouses where alcohol was stored before distribution. These weren't in residential neighborhoods where neighbors might complain. They were in industrial areas, labeled as produce storage or commercial facilities. Trucks moved the alcohol at night, using routes that avoided police checkpoints. Retail. Dragna didn't operate speakeasies directly. He sold to independent operators, club owners, restaurant managers, private party organizers, who marked up the alcohol and took the risk of being raided. If they were caught, the trail didn't lead back to Dragna. This system generated enormous profits. A case of whiskey smuggled from Mexico for $20 could be sold to speakeasy operators for $80 or more. A single successful shipment could generate $50,000 in profit, equivalent to over $800,000 today. And Dragna was running multiple shipments weekly. Dragna's success wasn't just about logistics, it required political protection. He couldn't operate massive bootlegging networks without law enforcement looking the other way. Dragna understood Los Angeles's political structure. The city was decentralized with multiple police departments, sheriffs, and municipal agencies that often competed or had unclear jurisdictions. This fragmentation created opportunities for selective corruption. Dragna didn't try to corrupt the mayor or police chief. That was too visible, too risky. Instead, he bribed mid-level officials, precinct captains, individual officers, county sheriffs in areas where he operated warehouses or landing sites. These officials could ignore specific operations, tip off Dragna about upcoming raids, or delay investigations. The bribes were substantial but not excessive. A few $100s monthly to a police sergeant making $200 a month was life-changing money. And the officials rationalized it easily. Prohibition was unpopular, enforcement was inconsistent, and everyone knew the law would eventually be repealed. Dragna also cultivated relationships with politicians through intermediaries. Legitimate Italian-American business owners who contributed to campaigns, attended fundraisers, and lobbied for favorable policies. Dragna stayed invisible, operating through layers of insulation. Dragna's defining characteristic as a mob boss was his commitment to avoiding attention. While Al Capone in Chicago was giving newspaper interviews and attending boxing matches, while Lucky Luciano in New York was becoming a celebrity criminal, Dragna remained invisible. He avoided flashy murders. When someone needed to be killed, a rival, an informant, a business owner who refused to pay, it was done quietly. Bodies were buried in the desert or dumped in remote locations. If they were found, they were dismissed as gang violence between unknown criminals, not major news stories. He avoided turf wars. When other criminal groups operated in LA, Chinese tongs, Jewish syndicates, Mexican gangs, Dragna negotiated rather than fought. He understood that violence attracted law enforcement and that most criminal markets were large enough to share. He avoided media attention. Dragna never gave interviews, never appeared in gossip columns, never attended Hollywood parties. He dressed modestly, lived in a middle-class house, and conducted business in produce markets and union offices, not expensive restaurants or nightclubs. The result was remarkable. By the early 1930s, most Los Angeles residents didn't believe the Mafia existed in their city. Newspapers occasionally mentioned Italian criminals or black hand gangs, but there was no public understanding of an organized hierarchical criminal family operating across Southern California. This invisibility was Dragna's greatest asset. While Eastern mob families faced federal investigations, congressional hearings, and aggressive journalism, Dragna operated with near impunity. Los Angeles in the 1920s and 1930s was more ethnically diverse than Eastern cities, and organized crime reflected that diversity. Chinese tongs controlled gambling and opium distribution in Chinatown. Jewish gangsters ran gambling operations in West LA and Hollywood. Mexican gangs operated in East LA. Dragna understood that trying to dominate all these groups would create constant warfare and attract attention he couldn't afford. Instead, he negotiated. He allowed Chinese tongs to operate in Chinatown as long as they didn't expand into Italian neighborhoods. He worked with Jewish gamblers, sometimes partnering on operations, sometimes dividing territory. This pragmatism kept Los Angeles relatively peaceful compared to Chicago or New York, where ethnic gang wars generated constant headlines. And it allowed Dragna to focus on his core operations, bootlegging, labor racketeering, and extortion, without distraction. When Prohibition was repealed in December 1933, many mobsters faced a crisis. Their most profitable racket was suddenly legal. But Dragna adapted. He'd already diversified into gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering. Bootlegging had been enormously profitable, but it wasn't his only revenue stream. He shifted focus to gambling, bookmaking, card games, numbers rackets, and to labor unions, particularly the Longshoremen's Union that controlled the ports. These operations were sustainable, less risky than bootlegging, and generated consistent profits. By the mid-1930s, Jack Dragna's position seemed unassailable. He controlled the Los Angeles Mafia family with absolute authority. His operations were profitable and growing. Law enforcement barely acknowledged his existence. But in the late 1930s, a new threat arrived from the East Coast, one that would challenge Dragna's authority, generate the only significant mob violence in LA history, and finally bring the Los Angeles Mafia into the national spotlight. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel was everything Jack Dragna wasn't. Flashy, violent, media-hungry, and utterly uninterested in staying quiet. Born in Brooklyn in 1906, Siegel had risen through the ranks of the East Coast Jewish mob alongside Meyer Lansky, establishing himself as a feared enforcer and later as a sophisticated criminal businessman. By the mid-1930s, Siegel and Lansky, along with partners like Lucky Luciano, controlled significant gambling and bootlegging operations in New York. But they understood that the real future of organized crime was in expanding west. California was growing rapidly. Hollywood attracted wealth. And most importantly, Nevada had just legalized gambling in 1931, creating opportunities for massive profits. In 1937, Siegel moved to Los Angeles with the blessing and financial backing of the East Coast Syndicate. His mission: establish gambling operations, build relationships with Hollywood figures, and eventually expand into Las Vegas. Siegel brought money, connections, and ambition. He rented a mansion in Beverly Hills, socialized with movie stars, and began organizing high-stakes gambling games for Hollywood celebrities and wealthy businessmen. He was charming, well-dressed, and dangerous, exactly the kind of criminal Los Angeles had never seen before. From Jack Dragna's perspective, Bugsy Siegel was a problem. Siegel was operating in LA without asking permission, without paying tribute, and without acknowledging Dragna's authority. In Mafia culture, this was unacceptable. Los Angeles was Dragna's territory. Any significant criminal operations required his approval. But Siegel didn't care about Dragna's authority. He had backing from Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, bosses far more powerful than Dragna. He saw Dragna as a small-time operator running a provincial operation in a backwater city. Siegel was building something bigger, a national gambling empire that would eventually include the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. The tension between Siegel and Dragna represented a fundamental clash between two models of organized crime. Dragna's model, quiet, disciplined, focused on sustainable local operations. Avoid attention, maintain political protection, survive through invisibility. Siegel's model, flashy, aggressive, focused on expansion and innovation. Court media attention, build glamorous operations, dominate through personality and violence. Dragna believed Siegel's approach would destroy everything he'd built. The flashy Hollywood parties, the high-profile gambling games, the celebrity connections, all of it attracted attention. Newspapers started writing about gangsters in Hollywood. Police started investigating. Reformers started demanding crackdowns. Siegel, for his part, believed Dragna was irrelevant. The future of organized crime was in legal gambling in Nevada, in Hollywood connections, in building massive casinos that generated millions. Dragna's small-time extortion and union rackets were yesterday's game. The situation became more complicated with the arrival of Mickey Cohen, a violent, charismatic Los Angeles native who'd worked for the East Coast mob and returned to L.A. as Siegel's lieutenant. Cohen ran bookmaking operations, managed Siegel's gambling interests, and enforced discipline through extreme violence. Cohen was even flashier than Siegel, wearing expensive suits, driving luxury cars, frequenting nightclubs, and giving interviews to gossip columnists. He embodied everything Dragna hated about the Jewish mob's approach: publicity, flash, violence that attracted attention. Dragna tried to negotiate. He met with Siegel, proposed profit-sharing arrangements, offered to divide territory. But Siegel rejected compromise. He was backed by the National Syndicate. He didn't need Dragna's approval. The tension escalated throughout the 1940s, but remained mostly non-violent. Dragna understood that killing Siegel would trigger retaliation from the East Coast bosses. Siegel, for his part, was focused on Las Vegas and saw no value in starting a war with Dragna over L.A. But by 1947, the situation had changed. In 1946, Bugsy Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas, the first major resort casino on what would become the Strip. The project was funded by East Coast mob families, including Meyer Lansky's syndicate, with investments totaling over $6 million, an enormous sum. But the Flamingo was a disaster. Construction costs spiraled out of control. The opening was rushed and poorly organized. The casino lost money immediately. And worse, Siegel was suspected of skimming, stealing money from the construction budget and hiding it in Swiss bank accounts with his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. The East Coast bosses, Lansky, Luciano, Frank Costello, were furious. They'd invested millions based on Siegel's promises of massive profits. Instead, they were losing money, and Siegel appeared to be stealing from them. By early 1947, the decision was made. Bugsy Siegel had to be killed. June 20th, 1947. The murder of Bugsy Siegel at Virginia Hill's mansion in Beverly Hills was one of the most famous mob hits in American history. The shooter was never identified. The weapon was never found. No one was ever charged. But the hit had all the hallmarks of a professional mafia execution: careful planning, precise timing, immediate escape, absolute silence from everyone involved. Jack Dragna's involvement remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest he participated in planning the hit or provided local support, safe houses, weapons, getaway logistics. Others suggest the East Coast bosses handled everything and simply informed Dragna afterward. What's documented is that immediately after Siegel's death, Dragna attempted to reclaim control over gambling operations Siegel had built. He sent associates to Siegel's bookmaking operations, demanding tribute. He pressured independent gamblers to align with the Dragna family, but Mickey Cohen refused to comply. Mickey Cohen's refusal to submit to Jack Dragna's authority triggered the only significant public mob war in Los Angeles history. And it was everything Dragna had spent decades trying to avoid. Violent, public, covered extensively by newspapers, and attracting federal attention. Cohen was defiant. He'd been Siegel's lieutenant, had built connections throughout Los Angeles, and had backing from East Coast bosses who saw him as Siegel's legitimate successor. He wasn't going to bow to Dragna, whom he viewed as an outdated provincial operator. Dragna responded with violence, something he'd avoided for his entire criminal career. Between 1947 and 1950, Jack Dragna's organization made multiple attempts to kill Mickey Cohen. Every single one failed. August 18, 1948, Sherry's restaurant, Sunset Strip. Cohen was dining with associates at Sherry's, a popular restaurant on the Sunset Strip, when gunmen opened fire through the front windows. The attack was chaos. Shotgun blasts, breaking glass, screaming diners. Cohen's bodyguard, Nettie Herbert, was killed. Cohen himself was uninjured, protected by bodyguards who returned fire and by sheer luck. The attack made front-page news across Los Angeles. Newspapers ran photos of the shattered restaurant, interviewed witnesses, and speculated about gang warfare. Exactly the kind of attention Dragna had spent his career avoiding. July 20th, 1949. Cohen's haberdashery, Sunset Boulevard. Cohen owned a men's clothing store on Sunset Boulevard, which he used as a legitimate business and occasional office. On the night of July 20th, 1949, a bomb exploded under the store, destroying the interior and damaging neighboring businesses. Cohen wasn't present. The bomb was likely planted as a warning rather than a serious assassination attempt. But again, the attack generated massive media coverage. The LAPD launched investigations. Federal agents began paying attention. Reformers demanded action against organized crime. February 6, 1950. Cohen's home, Brentwood. The most brazen attempt occurred at Cohen's home in Brentwood. As Cohen and his wife were inside, gunmen fired over 100 rounds into the house using rifles and shotguns. Windows shattered. Walls were riddled with bullet holes. But once again, Cohen survived unharmed, protected by bodyguards and reinforced doors. The attack was covered by every newspaper in Los Angeles and picked up by national media. Photos of Cohen's bullet-riddled house appeared in magazines nationwide. The FBI opened formal investigations into organized crime in Los Angeles, something that had never happened during Dragna's decades of quiet control. The repeated failures to kill Mickey Cohen had multiple causes. Cohen's security. He traveled with armed bodyguards constantly, varied his routines, reinforced his home and businesses, and maintained intelligence networks that warned him of threats. Dragna's inexperience with violence. Dragna had built his career on avoiding violence. His organization wasn't structured for complex assassination operations. The soldiers carrying out the hits lacked the professional expertise of East Coast or Chicago hitmen. Law enforcement pressure. The public nature of the attacks meant police were investigating aggressively. This made planning subsequent attempts more difficult and dangerous. East Coast protection. Cohen maintained relationships with East Coast bosses who saw him as valuable. While they wouldn't openly oppose Dragna, they may have provided Cohen with intelligence or resources that helped him survive. The Mickey Cohen War was a disaster for Jack Dragna. Everything he'd built, the quiet control, the invisibility, the political protection, was compromised. The FBI, which had barely acknowledged the Los Angeles Mafia's existence before 1947, now had files on Dragna, his associates, and his operations. Federal agents conducted surveillance, planted informants, and built cases. The LAPD, previously willing to look the other way in exchange for bribes, faced public pressure to crack down on organized crime. Reform-minded officials demanded action. Corrupt officials who'd protected Dragna faced scrutiny. Newspapers, which had ignored Italian organized crime for decades, now ran regular stories about the Los Angeles mob war. Dragna's name appeared in print, something that had almost never happened before. By 1950, Dragna understood he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The attempt to eliminate Cohen had failed, and the attention it generated threatened everything. He backed off, de-escalating the conflict and returning to quiet operations. Cohen, meanwhile, had won. He maintained control over his gambling operations, continued his flashy lifestyle, and became a Los Angeles celebrity, giving interviews, appearing at nightclubs, even consulting on movies about organized crime. The irony was profound. Mickey Cohen, a small-time bookmaker compared to Dragna's multi-decade criminal empire, had defeated the Los Angeles Mafia boss by simply refusing to die and courting the media attention Dragna feared most. After the Cohen disaster, Jack Dragna returned to what he did best: quiet, disciplined criminal operations that generated consistent profits without attracting attention. By the early 1950s, despite the publicity of the Cohen War, the Dragna family still controlled significant criminal operations across Southern California. Dragna's most profitable and sustainable racket was control over labor unions, particularly the International Longshoremen's Association locals at the ports of San Pedro and Long Beach. The ports were critical to Southern California's economy. Billions of dollars in cargo moved through them annually. Manufactured goods from Asia, agricultural products heading to foreign markets, military supplies during and after World War II. Control over the longshoremen meant control over who worked, who got contracts, and who could afford labor disruptions. Dragna's influence operated through multiple layers. Union leadership. Dragna placed loyalists in union leadership positions or corrupted existing officials through bribes and threats. These officials ensured that Dragna-connected companies received favorable contracts and that workers loyal to the family got the best jobs. No-show jobs. Union contracts often included positions that paid well, but required little actual work. These jobs went to Dragna family members and associates, providing steady income with minimal effort. Extortion. Shipping companies that wanted labor peace paid tribute to avoid strikes, slowdowns, or accidents that damaged cargo. The payments were structured as consulting fees or donations to union funds, making them difficult to prosecute as extortion. The union racket was perfect for Dragna's style: low visibility, sustainable, and enormously profitable. And unlike bootlegging or gambling, it was largely immune to law enforcement pressure because it was embedded in legitimate business operations. Despite the Cohen War, Dragna maintained extensive gambling operations throughout Southern California. Bookmaking, taking bets on horse racing, sports, and other events. The operations were small-scale and distributed. Dozens of independent bookmakers paid tribute to the Dragna family for the right to operate. Card games and dice games, private gambling clubs in Italian neighborhoods, union halls, and social clubs. These weren't casinos, they were small operations that catered to working-class gamblers. Numbers rackets, a lottery-style game where players bet small amounts on number combinations. The game was popular in working-class communities and generated steady, reliable income. Dragna avoided the high-stakes, celebrity-focused gambling operations that Cohen ran. Those attracted attention and required constant management. Dragna's gambling networks were small, stable, and operated by associates who understood the importance of discretion. Dragna maintained influence in Hollywood, though more limited than Siegel had achieved. The influence operated primarily through craft unions, teamsters, stagehands, projectionists that worked on film productions and in movie theaters. Control over these unions allowed Dragna to extort production companies and theater owners through threats of strikes or equipment problems. The extortion was subtle. Payments disguised as union contributions or consulting fees, and rarely resulted in public confrontations. Dragna also provided services to Hollywood figures, illegal gambling for celebrities, loans at usurious rates, and problem solving for producers who needed labor issues resolved quietly. But Dragna understood Hollywood's limits. The industry was too visible, too connected to national media, too full of outsiders who didn't understand or respect Mafia codes. He took what he could without overreaching. The early 1950s marked the beginning of sustained federal attention to the Los Angeles Mafia. The FBI, which had focused primarily on East Coast and Midwest families, began investigating Dragna's operations. But ironically, Dragna's low-violence approach protected him. The FBI prioritized investigations based on violence and public impact. Families like the Genoveses in New York or the Outfit in Chicago, which generated constant headlines through murders and bombings, received the most attention. Dragna's operations, labor racketeering, small-scale gambling, quiet extortion, didn't generate headlines and weren't seen as urgent national priorities. FBI surveillance was limited, investigations were sporadic, and prosecutions were rare. In 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver launched a congressional investigation into organized crime, the first major federal inquiry into the Mafia. The Kefauver Committee held hearings across the country, subpoenaing mob bosses, questioning them under oath, and broadcasting proceedings on television. Jack Dragna was subpoenaed to testify. He appeared briefly, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights, and said almost nothing. He wasn't defiant or theatrical like other mobsters who testified. He was quiet, respectful, and utterly unrevealing. The hearings generated enormous publicity for Eastern mob figures, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky. Others became household names. But Dragna remained obscure. Most Americans watching the hearings had never heard of the Los Angeles Mafia and left the hearings with the same impression. Dragna's invisibility, even during a national investigation, was remarkable. By the early 1950s, Jack Dragna was in his 60s and suffering from heart problems. His health declined steadily throughout the decade, limiting his hands-on management of family operations. Leadership responsibilities increasingly fell to his brother Tom and to underboss Frank DeSimone, a lawyer who'd been with the family since the 1930s. But neither man had Jack's strategic vision, his discipline, or his ability to maintain the careful balance between profitability and invisibility. Jack Dragna died of a heart attack on February 23, 1956, at age 64. His death marked the end of an era, over 30 years of disciplined, quiet control over the Los Angeles Mafia. His funeral was attended by family, close associates, and a few FBI agents conducting surveillance. There were no dramatic mob funerals, no processions through Italian neighborhoods, no media coverage. Even in death, Dragna maintained the invisibility he'd cultivated his entire criminal career. The question now was whether his successors could maintain what he'd built. They couldn't. When Jack Dragna died in February 1956, the Los Angeles crime family faced a succession crisis. The obvious choice, Tom Dragna, Jack's brother and longtime underboss, was aging and in poor health himself. He declined the position, preferring a semi-retirement role as consigliere. The family's ruling committee chose Frank DeSimone, a lawyer who'd been associated with the family since the 1930s. On paper, DeSimone seemed qualified. He was educated, sophisticated, understood both legitimate business and criminal operations, and had served as the family's legal advisor for years. In reality, DeSimone was a catastrophic choice. Frank DeSimone lacked the essential qualities that had made Jack Dragna successful: discipline, strategic vision, and absolute commitment to invisibility. DeSimone was sloppy. He talked too much, trusted the wrong people, and failed to maintain the security protocols that had protected the family for decades. He conducted family business over phones that were likely tapped, met with associates in public locations, and failed to vary his routines in ways that would complicate surveillance. He also lacked respect within the organization. Made men who'd worked under Jack Dragna, disciplined, experienced criminals who'd survived for decades, viewed DeSimone as weak, indecisive, and out of touch with street-level operations. Younger members saw him as an old man clinging to outdated methods in a changing criminal landscape. But DeSimone's most catastrophic failure came in 1957, during one of the most important events in American Mafia history. In November 1957, crime bosses from across the United States gathered at the estate of Joseph, Joe the Barber, Barbara, in Apalachin, New York. The meeting was intended to be secret, a summit to discuss national mafia business, resolve disputes, and coordinate operations. Over 100 mobsters attended, including bosses from New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and other cities. Frank DeSimone represented the Los Angeles family, traveling across the country to attend. The meeting was a disaster. Local police noticed the unusual number of expensive cars with out-of-state plates converging on Barbara's estate. They set up a roadblock. When mobsters realized law enforcement was present, they fled, running through the woods, abandoning cars, desperately trying to escape. Over 60 mobsters were detained, identified, and questioned. The Apalachin raid became national news, providing undeniable proof that a national organized crime network existed, something the FBI and federal prosecutors had suspected but never conclusively demonstrated. Frank DeSimone was among those caught fleeing. He was identified, questioned, and released. But the damage was done. The Apalachin raid triggered intensive FBI surveillance of everyone who'd been present. Agents planted bugs, tapped phones, and monitored the activities of identified mobsters. In late 1957 or early 1958, FBI wiretaps captured Frank DeSimone in a conversation where he explicitly acknowledged being a member of the Mafia and discussed organizational matters. The exact content of the conversation remains partially sealed, but court documents and later testimony confirm that DeSimone essentially confessed his membership and role in the organization. Something no disciplined mob boss would ever do, even in private conversations. The recording was inadmissible in court due to legal technicalities regarding how it was obtained, but it provided the FBI with invaluable intelligence. They now had confirmed leadership of the Los Angeles family, understood its structure, and had evidence they could use to pressure lower-level members into cooperation. DeSimone's sloppiness had destroyed the invisibility Jack Dragna had spent 3 decades building. Under DeSimone's weak leadership, the Los Angeles crime family fragmented. Made men operated increasingly independently, pursuing their own rackets without coordinating with family leadership. Younger members questioned why they should share profits with an organization that provided little protection and less strategic direction. Revenue declined. The labor union rackets that had been so profitable under Jack Dragna were under increasing federal scrutiny. The Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959 gave the federal government new tools to investigate and prosecute union corruption, and the FBI was using those tools aggressively. Gambling operations faced competition from independent bookmakers who refused to pay tribute, correctly calculating that DeSimone lacked the authority or will to enforce discipline. Some paid tribute to East Coast families instead, seeking protection from more powerful organizations. The family's reputation suffered. Word spread through the national Mafia network that Los Angeles was weak, poorly led, and vulnerable. This emboldened rivals and made it difficult to form alliances or conduct business with other families. Frank DeSimone died of a heart attack on August 4, 1967, at age 62. His 11 years as boss had been marked by declining influence, fragmented operations, and the loss of the disciplined structure Jack Dragna had built. At the time of his death, the Los Angeles crime family was a shell of what it had been in the 1950s. Leadership was unclear. Operations were scattered. Federal pressure was increasing, and the criminal landscape of Los Angeles was changing in ways that made the traditional Italian mafia increasingly irrelevant. One of the fundamental principles of the mafia had always been omerta, the code of silence. Made men never cooperated with authorities, never testified against fellow members, accepted prison sentences rather than betray the organization. But by the 1960s and 1970s, that code was breaking down. The sentences for racketeering and organized crime had become so severe, often life in prison, that cooperation became the only rational choice for mobsters facing prosecution. Federal prosecutors offered deals, testify, and your sentence is reduced dramatically. Refuse, and you die in prison. The Los Angeles family, weakened by poor leadership and fragmented operations, was particularly vulnerable to this pressure. And in the 1970s, one informant would devastate what remained of the organization. Aladina, Jimmy the Weasel, Fratiano was born in Naples, Italy, in 1913 and immigrated to Cleveland as a child. He became involved in organized crime as a teenager and eventually joined the Los Angeles crime family in the 1940s, working his way up to become a capo, a captain managing his own crew. Fratiano was a career criminal, involved in robbery, extortion, loan sharking, and murder. He was made in the 1940s and remained a loyal, active member for over 30 years. He'd survived the transition from Jack Dragna to Frank DeSimone and had seen the family's decline firsthand. But in the mid-1970s, facing serious federal charges and a potential life sentence, Fratiano made a decision that would shock the Los Angeles underworld. He agreed to cooperate with the FBI. In 1977, Jimmy Fratiano became a government witness, providing testimony about the Los Angeles crime family, its operations, its leadership, and its connections to other mafia families across the country. Fratiano's cooperation was unprecedented in scope. He testified about murders he'd committed or witnessed. He explained the family's structure, naming made men, associates, and front businesses. He described labor racketeering operations, gambling networks, and extortion schemes. He provided details about meetings with bosses from other families, revealing the national network of organized crime. His testimony led to dozens of indictments and convictions. Made men who'd operated for decades were suddenly facing federal charges backed by detailed, credible testimony from an insider. Associates who thought they were insulated from prosecution found themselves named in GRICO indictments. But more damaging than the specific convictions was the psychological impact. Fratiano's cooperation proved that omerta was dead. If a made man, a capo who'd been in the family for 30 years, could flip, then anyone could. Trust within the organization collapsed. Made men suspected each other of being informants. Conversations were guarded. Paranoia became rational. In 1981, Fratianno published a memoir titled The Last Mafioso, written with journalist Ovid Damaris. The book detailed his life in organized crime, named names, described murders, and exposed the inner workings of the Los Angeles crime family and the broader Mafia network. The book was a bestseller, bringing unprecedented public attention to the Los Angeles Mafia, attention that Jack Dragna had spent his entire career avoiding. Suddenly, the general public understood that Los Angeles had a Mafia family, knew who its members were, and had access to detailed accounts of their operations. For an organization built on invisibility, this exposure was catastrophic. Fratianno's cooperation opened the floodgates. Other Los Angeles family members facing prosecution and seeing that cooperation was possible began making their own deals. The FBI, emboldened by the success of Fratianno's testimony, pressured more mobsters to flip. Federal prosecutors offered increasingly generous deals to witnesses willing to testify. The message was clear: cooperate and you might walk free. Refuse and you'll die in prison. By the early 1980s, the Los Angeles crime family was hemorrhaging members to prosecution and cooperation. The organization that had survived for over 50 years was collapsing from within. Even if the Los Angeles Mafia family had maintained strong leadership and internal discipline, it would have faced enormous challenges from the changing nature of organized crime in Southern California. The 1970s and 1980s saw the explosion of drug trafficking, cocaine from Colombia, heroin from Mexico and Asia, marijuana from Mexico. The profits were staggering, dwarfing what traditional mafia rackets like gambling and loan sharking could generate. But the Italian mafia was poorly positioned to exploit these opportunities. Drug trafficking required different skills, different networks, and different international connections than the traditional rackets. The Colombians controlled cocaine supply. Mexican cartels controlled heroin and marijuana distribution. Asian gangs controlled heroin from the Golden Triangle. The Los Angeles crime family, already weakened by poor leadership and informants, couldn't compete. Some individual members became involved in drug trafficking, but the organization as a whole lacked the structure and connections to dominate the trade. The growth of Mexican organized crime, both cartels and the Mexican Mafia prison gang, fundamentally changed Southern California's criminal landscape. The Mexican Mafia, founded in the California prison system in the 1950s, grew into a powerful force controlling drug distribution, extortion, and violent crime throughout Southern California. Mexican cartels, meanwhile, established distribution networks that brought drugs directly from Mexico to Los Angeles, bypassing the middlemen and distribution systems that traditional organized crime had relied on. The Italian Mafia had no meaningful way to compete with these organizations. They lacked the ethnic connections, the supply networks, and the willingness to use the extreme violence that characterized Mexican organized crime. Chinese, Vietnamese, and other Asian criminal organizations emerged in Los Angeles in the 1970s and 1980s, controlling gambling, extortion, and drug trafficking in Asian communities. These groups operated with their own codes, their own languages, and their own networks, largely impenetrable to the Italian Mafia. Attempts by the Los Angeles family to extort or tax Asian criminal operations were largely unsuccessful. The cultural and language barriers were too great, and the Asian groups were often more violent and better organized than the weakened Italian family. Outlaw motorcycle gangs, particularly the Hells Angels and the Mongols, became significant criminal organizations in California, controlling drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, and violent crime. These groups operated with structures and codes that resembled the Mafia, but they were younger, more violent, and more willing to engage in direct confrontation with law enforcement. The Italian Mafia's traditional methods, corruption, intimidation, quiet control, were ineffective against biker gangs that embraced publicity, violence, and confrontation. Perhaps most damaging, the traditional rackets that the Mafia had controlled, bookmaking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, were increasingly dominated by independent operators who refused to pay tribute to a weakened, fragmented organization. Without strong leadership and the willingness to enforce discipline through violence, the Los Angeles crime family couldn't maintain control over these operations. Bookmakers operated independently. Loan sharks kept all their profits. Labor racketeering became the domain of corrupt union officials who worked directly with businesses rather than through Mafia intermediaries. The entire model that Jack Dragna had built, quiet control over traditional rackets through discipline and strategic invisibility, was becoming obsolete. After Frank DeSimone's death in 1967, Dominic "Nick" Licata became boss of the Los Angeles crime family. Licata was a long-time member who'd been involved in family operations since the 1930s. He was respected, experienced, and understood the old ways of operating. But Licata inherited an organization in crisis. Federal pressure was intense. Informants had exposed operations. Traditional rackets were under attack from competitors. The family's reputation within the national Mafia network was at its lowest point. Licata attempted to stabilize the situation. He focused on maintaining what remained of the family's core operations. Some labor union influence, gambling networks that still paid tribute, and extortion operations in Italian communities. He avoided expansion, avoided confrontation, and tried to rebuild the discipline and structure that had characterized the family under Jack Dragna. But the challenges were overwhelming. The FBI had extensive files on the family, knew who the made men were, and conducted regular surveillance. Younger members were increasingly unwilling to follow old codes or share profits with an organization that provided little value. The criminal landscape had changed so fundamentally that traditional Mafia methods were increasingly irrelevant. Licata also faced health problems. By the early 1970s, he was elderly and suffering from various ailments that limited his ability to lead effectively. October 19, 1974. Licata Dies. Nick Licata died on October 19, 1974, at age 77. His death marked the end of the generation of mobsters who'd worked directly under Jack Dragna and remembered the family's glory years. Leadership passed to Dominic Brooklier, who would face even more severe challenges in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Dominic Brooklier, born Domenico Brucialeri, became boss in 1974. He'd been a made man since the 1950s and had survived the transitions from DeSimone to Licata. But Brooklier's tenure would be marked by constant federal prosecution, the devastation of Fratiano's cooperation, and the final fragmentation of the family. In 1975, Brooklier and several associates were indicted on charges related to extorting pornography distributors in Los Angeles. The charges allege that the family had demanded payments from adult bookstores and film distributors, threatening violence if payments weren't made. The case was emblematic of how far the family had fallen. Jack Dragna had controlled major industries, longshoremen's unions, produce markets, legitimate businesses. Now, the family was reduced to extorting pornography shops, a low-level racket that generated minimal profits and maximum law enforcement attention. Brooklier was convicted and sentenced to federal prison. He served time through the late 1970s. leading the family from prison through intermediaries and visiting family members. Jimmy Fratiano's cooperation, which began in 1977, devastated the Brooklier administration. Fratiano had worked closely with Brooklier and could testify about murders, extortion, and family operations in detail. Based largely on Fratiano's testimony, federal prosecutors indicted dozens of Los Angeles family members and associates throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. Convictions followed. Made men who'd operated for decades went to prison. The family's already limited operations collapsed further. Brooklier himself faced additional charges based on Fratiano's testimony, but died before facing trial. Dominic Brooklier died on January 18, 1984, at age 69, while under federal indictment. His death effectively ended any pretense of centralized leadership for the Los Angeles crime family. After Brooklier's death, Peter Milano, son of former underboss Anthony Milano, became boss of what remained of the Los Angeles crime family. But by 1984, there was almost nothing left to lead. The family consisted of perhaps 20 to 30 made men and a similar number of associates. Most were elderly. Many were under federal indictment or serving prison sentences. Operations were limited to small-scale gambling, loan sharking, and occasional extortion. Nothing remotely resembling the systematic control Jack Dragna had exercised. Milano kept an extremely low profile, operating so quietly that even law enforcement occasionally questioned whether the Los Angeles family still existed in any meaningful sense. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, federal prosecutors continued targeting what remained of the Los Angeles family through RICO statutes. Indictments were brought against Milano and various associates, charging them with racketeering, extortion, and illegal gambling. Most defendants pleaded guilty, accepting relatively short sentences rather than risk trials that could result in decades in prison. The guilty pleas were pragmatic. The evidence was overwhelming, cooperation from informants was routine, and fighting charges was expensive and futile. In 1995, Peter Milano was convicted of racketeering charges related to illegal gambling operations and sentenced to 6 years in federal prison. He was released in 2000 and supposedly retired from organized crime, though federal authorities continued monitoring him. Peter Milano died on April 21, 2012, at age 84. His death marked the symbolic end of the Los Angeles crime family as an organized entity. While a handful of elderly former members remained alive, there was no longer any meaningful structure, no operations worth mentioning, and no indication that the organization would ever be reconstituted. The Los Angeles Mafia family, which had ruled Southern California organized crime for over 50 years, had simply faded away. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, as the Los Angeles family fragmented under weak leadership and federal pressure, Louis Tom Dragna, Jack Dragna's nephew, attempted to rebuild some version of the organization his uncle had created. Louis Tom Dragna had been involved in family operations since the 1950s. He understood how Jack had built and maintained power. He recognized that the family's decline stemmed from abandoning the principles that had made Jack successful. Discipline, invisibility, focus on sustainable operations rather than flashy ventures. But Louis Tom faced insurmountable obstacles, federal scrutiny. The FBI knew who he was, monitored his activities, and investigated any operation he became involved in. The invisibility that had protected Jack was impossible to recreate in an era of sophisticated surveillance. Competition. The criminal landscape had changed fundamentally. Mexican cartels, Asian gangs, motorcycle clubs, and independent operators controlled the lucrative rackets. The traditional Italian mafia model, quiet control through discipline and political corruption, no longer worked. Demographics. The Italian-American community that had sustained the family was assimilating, moving to suburbs, leaving traditional urban neighborhoods. The new generation had legitimate opportunities their parents and grandparents hadn't had. Criminal recruitment became increasingly difficult. Informants. The culture of omerta was dead. Anyone facing serious charges could cooperate, and most did. Building an organization required trust, and trust was impossible when cooperation was routine. Jack Dragna operated gambling networks, maintained some labor union connections, and tried to coordinate what remained of the family's scattered operations. But these were small-scale efforts that generated minimal profits and attracted constant law enforcement attention. Despite his efforts, Jack Dragna couldn't restore the Los Angeles crime family to anything resembling its former status. The conditions that had allowed Jack Dragna to build a powerful, invisible criminal organization for over 30 years simply no longer existed. By the 1990s, Louis Tom had largely retired from active criminal operations, living quietly, while federal authorities occasionally monitored him out of historical interest, rather than current concern. He represented the last direct link to the Dragna era, the final remnant of a family that had once controlled organized crime across Southern California, but had been destroyed by weak leadership, changing criminal markets, and federal prosecution. The Los Angeles crime family's greatest strength, its invisibility, became the reason it's been largely forgotten by history. Jack Dragna built an organization that operated for over 30 years with minimal public awareness. Most Los Angeles residents in the 1940s and 1950s didn't know the Mafia existed in their city. Newspapers rarely covered Italian organized crime. Law enforcement largely ignored the family because it generated so little violence and public disruption. This invisibility allowed the family to operate profitably and safely. But it also meant that when the family eventually collapsed, there was little public interest or historical record to preserve its story. American popular culture loves dramatic mob stories. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the public wars between Capone and his rivals, the sensational murders that defined East Coast families. These stories generate books, movies, documentaries, and endless public fascination. The Los Angeles family had almost none of this. There were no mass shootings, no spectacular murders, except Bugsy Siegel's, which is remembered more for Siegel than for the LA. Family. No public wars that generated headlines. The Mickey Cohen conflict was the family's only sustained violent period, and even that was relatively minor compared to East Coast gang wars. Without dramatic narratives, the Los Angeles family failed to capture public imagination. And without public interest, historians and journalists paid little attention. The Mafia has historically been associated with Eastern and Midwestern cities: New York, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia. Los Angeles, geographically and culturally distant, never fit the popular conception of Mafia territory. When Americans think organized crime in Los Angeles, they think of Hollywood scandals, not Italian mobsters. The city's image as a place of sunshine, entertainment, and suburban sprawl contradicts the urban, ethnic, working-class environment typically associated with the Mafia. This geographic and cultural disconnect meant that even when the LA family was powerful, it was viewed as peripheral to the real Mafia on the East Coast. The wave of Mafia informants that began in the 1970s and 1980s, Henry Hill, Sammy Gravano, Jimmy Fratiano, and others, brought unprecedented public attention to organized crime through their testimony, books, and media appearances. But most of these informants came from Eastern families. Fratiano was the notable exception, and his testimony did bring attention to the LA family. But by then, the family was already in terminal decline. There was no dramatic organization to expose, no powerful bosses to bring down, no sensational murders to reveal. By the time the public learned about the Los Angeles Mafia, it was already essentially over. Books, documentaries, and films about the Mafia overwhelmingly focus on New York and Chicago. Martin Scorsese's films, Goodfellas, Casino, The Irishman, all center on Eastern organized crime. The Godfather is set in New York. The Sopranos is set in New Jersey. This concentration of media attention creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Audiences are interested in the stories they've already heard about, so new content focuses on the same families and cities, which means other stories, like the Los Angeles family, remain obscure. Ultimately, the Dragna family's historical obscurity is the final proof of Jack Dragna's strategic genius. He built an organization that operated profitably for over 30 years, while remaining almost completely invisible to the public, the media, and much of law enforcement. That invisibility was deliberate, strategic, and enormously effective during his lifetime. But it also meant that when the family eventually collapsed, there was little historical record, little public memory, and little cultural legacy. Jack Dragna won by staying quiet, but in winning that way, he ensured that history would largely forget him.